Live from New Hampshire, it's time for the Science Cafe!
Learn about the latest technologic innovations today.
And you don't have to pay.
Expert panels with advanced degrees are sure to satisfy your curiosity.
Did we mention it's free?
And if you think you'll find a better time than this, then come on down and test your hypothesis. Cause you're gonna learn a lot if you wanna stay down at the Science Cafe.
First we have Dr. Melissa Duxbury, and she is a board-certified family medicine doctor in Hudson who's affiliated with Southern New Hampshire Medical Center. She received her degree from the State University of New York Upstate, and she completed her residency at St. John Hospital in Syracuse. She presently serves as the president-elect of the New Hampshire chapter of the American Academy of Family Physicians. Thank you for being here. And on the far side is Dr. Susan Barbaro. Her specialties are environmental microbiology, medical microbiology, ecology, and environmental science. And Dr. Barbaro completed her master's, and after that she got employment at an agricultural biotechnical firm who was developing biological pest controls instead of chemical. She decided that she didn't like industry and would rather be in academia. So she went back and got her PhD, and her first teaching job was at Delaware State University. In 2003, she joined the faculty of Revere. And finally, in the middle is Flavia Martin. And I don't have a bio for Flavia. I know that she's a public health nurse in the city of Nashua. So I'll ask each of the panelists to introduce themselves a little more fully, and then we'll go on to questions from the audience about the flu.
I'm Dr. Melissa Duxbury. I've been a family medicine doctor in Hudson, actually about 16 years now. So I've seen the flu come and go. I've seen a lot of different versions of it over the last 16 years. I am a primary care physician, which means birth to death. I actually do newborns and babies, and I think my oldest patient is currently 98.
I'm Flavia Martin. I'm a public health nurse for the city of Nashua. I am fairly new in my position there, and I came to this position because I'm really passionate about outreach and teaching the community about I'm sorry, it's my first time doing this. About healthy and safe habits and really promoting health across all different ages and populations and spans. What's going on with the flu right now is that we really focus on primary prevention, which is to prevent disease before it occurs. So we're constantly doing outreach in the community, education about health and safe habits, immunizations against diseases. So we're always doing outreach and teaching. We've been to the senior center, adult learning center, soup kitchen and area shelters, all promoting this, doing vaccinations, the library, police station, at all Nashua schools, and we vaccinate all city employees too.
I'm Susan Barbaro. I did my undergraduate degree at Concordia University in Montreal, Quebec. And I did my master's and PhD at University of Waterloo in Waterloo, Ontario. I came to the United States with my husband, who is an American. I'm still an alien resident, so don't tell anybody. I've been employed at Rivier University for almost 15 years now. I consider myself a microbial ecologist. I don't work with viruses other than in the capacity of teaching exercises. I am responsible for teaching the nursing students medical microbiology. I consider myself a microbial ecologist, and viruses are an important member of any community. So I hope that we can answer all of your questions.
If you could fill us in on where New Hampshire is right now with the flu, and because we've heard, of course, little ones dying and stuff, but wondered what the impact was here in New Hampshire, and maybe you can pass it off.
Yeah, and then I'll pass it down because public health does a lot of this too. I checked again this morning because they update, if you're ever interested in any of this, cdc.gov. I recommend people not get their source of information from Wikipedia Facebook, Wiki anything. The CDC.gov has a list of everything. We're currently in widespread, and actually that's only happened in the last 2 or 3 weeks. We're sporadic, and we've seen a huge uptick nationwide as well as in the state of New Hampshire. So thus far there have been 63, I believe, pediatric deaths across the country. 80% of those were not vaccinated. Last year in the deaths, we had 110 pediatric deaths last year. So we are a little bit above, but the hard part is the flu season is nowhere near over. In what I've seen in my practice, I have seen flu A, flu B, H3, and a couple H1N1s. If you look on the state website, you can also go to the Department of Health and Human Services. They actually have a listing of what's been identified. Remember, what's identified is what we tested and sent. There are thousands of people throughout the state and the country that we don't necessarily test because they're symptomatic and we know that they have flu. We are in my office the other day, we were down to 4 for all of immediate care and 6 providers, flu swabs for the rapid flu. So when I started, that didn't exist. You walk like a duck, you look like a duck, you had flu. So, you know, I always tell patients a positive test is helpful. A negative test doesn't necessarily mean you don't have flu. It just means the test was negative. So you have to use your clinical judgment. Currently, as far as I'm aware, I think there have been a few younger, I think there's 1 or 2 that come to mind that were under 65. Standardly, a lot of patients over the age of 65 in this age range will die from complications of flu, frequently pneumonia. But we're actually doing a little bit better than nationwide at the moment, but we do have a relatively speaking good vaccination rate in the state of New Hampshire comparatively to some other places, so that may be why.
Okay, so like Melissa said, we've had 63 total childhood deaths nationwide. Right. In New Hampshire, we've had 0, so that's really, really good for us. We've had 24 adult deaths from complication of the flu. What we do, we go out there and just really teach people of what's going on and really promote the vaccine. We are educating them, you know, to cover your cough, don't go to work if you're sick, so you're not spreading it to the people surrounding you.
I know that the virus can mutate over time, and that's why you need a certain amount of time to make the vaccine, but are there any common epitopes that they can make a vaccine to that should be consistent year by year?
They're currently looking into, I mean, they've been actually looking into it for a long time, and they're having difficulty with that because what they make the vaccine for, these little proteins that are expressed on the surface of the envelope virus, is what's most stimulatory to the immune system. So it makes the best vaccine. And amongst the types, they have different proteins that are not common to all of the viruses. So they're looking into it, but they're not there, and they're not thinking that they're very close to that either. They're still just looking at those markers that are expressed that are very immunogenic, that really stimulate the immune system.
Question over here.
Talking about ads and publicity, do products like Airborne really help build the immune system? Like, people take it before they get on planes. Does that help at all?
Well, I'm going to be a psychologist now and say, you think it works? It might just work for you. You know, there might be, for some people that might happen, but really you need to eat well, get lots of rest, exercise, and it's your immune system that's going to carry you through. So those are the things that are going to keep you healthy, and washing your hands, and be careful who you're, smooching with, or, so if it might be a nutrient that you haven't had for a while, supplementing your diet maybe, but I don't know. Again, if you've got a healthy mind, it might.
and you might be able to help me more on that, but I remember from medical school, Linus Pauling, who was a very, very smart man, where all this came from is he had done some initial work in vitamin C being a good antioxidant and a somewhat good antiviral. So a lot of that work kind of came out of, Linus Pauling was a very bright man, so fair enough. I think it's not going to harm you, and I agree that if you feel like it helps, and they're tasty, I've had them, they're really good, and you feel like you're doing something, I think it's more important that you end up having to drink water after you take them, or you drink them with water, because hydration is probably a key for all of us. You'll see all of us drinking water up here. But again, I tell people, as long as it's not harmful to you, I don't know whether it's beneficial.
Okay, any next question?
Number one, how long is my vaccine good for? And then as it relates to this cyclical thing that you've made reference to, what goes on cyclically where there's new sources, apparently, and new chemical makeup, and then this sort of guessing which things to attack, at least according to my understanding. So talk a little bit about the cycle of the flus that come over time, over seasons, if you will, and how long my vaccine is good for.
So in theory, if you look at the studies, there are several studies that say anywhere between 6 months to almost a year for some vaccines. Currently, we vaccinate every single year, but we don't have any long-term data for how long you're going to be immune for. I generally tell patients to vaccinate around October. That generally gets us through most people 6 months to May or June. I have seen people, and again, when you've been vaccinated for one, and it's interesting. I've seen times where it's in the, say we'll call it, H1N1 was in the vaccine in 2009. And in 2010, you see less of that. I think it carries over a little bit longer than we're aware of. Your body has good sense memory for those sorts of things. But you do need to get a new one every year, even if it's the H1N1 and the H1N1, because we need to rebooster. Your body takes those proteins out. And I will throw this out there. Many people tell me, Dr. I get the flu from the flu shot. That is just as likely as eating alphabet soup and pooping out Charles Dickens. It's not going to happen, okay? It's pieces of letters, okay? It's not going to happen. You may have an immunogenic reaction. That is good. Your body is supposed to be doing that, okay? You're supposed to be making immunity. I always feel sick the next day. It's better than the flu. But what's important is that you get it every single year, because she's right, that what happens over time is it changes. The capsids on the outside and the RNA on the inside. The more you're exposed to this, people think it's worse for you. The more you're exposed to it, the better you're going to be. Patients who were born before probably 1959, 1960, everyone had measles, mumps, and rubella, right? Everyone knew somebody who, in fact, you'd have parties. Everybody go get the measles. I had chickenpox. Everybody have chickenpox parties. That immunity lasts for life. Okay, so immunity is good. You're making your immunity is good, and you should do the vaccine every single year. The vaccine from the year before, in theory, is gone by the next year.
Also, everybody's immune system is an individual as well. So some people might have much longer lived memory cells than somebody else. So just the normal nature of viruses lend them to mutations. So, the basic unit of life is the cell, and viruses aren't cells. They're just this little protein cap with nucleic acid in it. And it's technically not living because it can't reproduce by itself. It has to get inside one of our cells. For influenza, that happens to be the ciliated epithelial cells of our respiratory tract. They attach to a little acid that protrudes from those cells. They get incorporated into our cells, and then they pretty much take over the machinery of those cells. It makes our cells make copies of their RNA, their nucleic acid. They make our cells make the proteins for the little capsid that encloses the RNA. So there's a couple of things that happen. Because they make lots of themselves really quickly, replicating that RNA, the more often you replicate DNA, the chances of having a mutation of boo-boo in replicating that molecule increases. The other thing is, because our cells are doing most of the work, when our cells replicate our DNA or transcribe it into messenger RNA, there's proofreading abilities. Oh, gee, I put the wrong base here. I'll just take that out and I'll put a new one in. Like, our enzymes can do some proofreading. But our cells are now trying to replicate this other virus nucleic acid, and those proofreadings break down. And so because they're making many, many copies, the replication is increased, the chances of boo-boos then increase. And so it only takes a couple of boo-boos, and if those boo-boos are being made on those little proteins that I was telling you about that protrude from the surface that are very immunogenic, couple of changes causes the immune system to have to find it again, respond to that, even those two little changes, and that takes a whole bunch of time to get that so that you can get memory cells and produce antibodies to it. So the short answer is, because that proofreading, those little changes occur frequently, and that's why, at one time there might have been the protein looks like this, a little boo-boo's made, now it looks like this. If you get a vaccine that's going to look for this protein, it's not going to bind to this protein. So you've got to make a vaccine that sees this protein. And so that's why they're checking people, they're trying to look at what protein is protruding, and they'll make a vaccine for that. But in the meantime, it's gone through a whole bunch of other people, it's produced more mutations, and now you have this protein. And there's no vaccine for that, because that wasn't anticipated.
Is the flu the real killer, or is complications like pneumonia and other things from the flu the killer? Because it's killing a lot of people, as we've talked about. What's really the mechanism that's causing the deaths?
So influenza itself, rarely itself causes the death unless it causes sepsis. And sepsis is basically all the fluids in all of your body. Like she was saying, they're working to do something else, okay? They're busy. They're busy making more flu. They're not protecting you. All of those cells are doing something else. Frequently, patients will get sepsis. Most frequently, what I see in my patients who have died from flu, I've not had a lot, but I've had a few, unfortunately. One younger one, many, many years ago with H1N1, who had significant medical conditions. That what happened with her is that she ended up having heart trouble, and the heart trouble became the problem. The problem with flu isn't just the flu, it is partly the flu, because it invades all those cells we're talking about, invades all of your ciliary cells, that's a lot. And then your whole body's working to fight it, and sometimes the body's actually working with it, even though it doesn't want to. But then you'll get pneumonia or secondary infection. I just did this week, I had a patient who I knew needed Tamiflu. They called and said, blah, 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 sick. I said, that's great. I need to see them because I'm not really worried about the flu. I can give you Tamiflu if you are, and actually you guys can talk about that too, who should get Tamiflu, who might not need it. But my bigger concern was, do they have a secondary infection? And sure enough, I brought this kid in, beet red ear, no complaints. So he could have gotten worse, could have gotten septic, just given him over the phone Tamiflu wouldn't have fixed his ear infection. So it's not particularly the flu that I'm as worried about in some ways. It's the stuff that they may not feel, because he didn't feel it. He was so sick. Everything hurts. Oh my God, everything hurts. But his ear was, the color of her shirt, and he clearly had an otitis media that he got within 48 hours of having influenza, which is more common with flu. Usually it takes 10 days otherwise. So.
Most viruses are doing exactly the same thing in the body. When they get inside your cells and replicate, they have to leave to get to neighboring cells. When they do that, they damage those cells. that is trauma to the body. It's like when you grab your hangnail and you rip it off, like what happens? Like all of a sudden, you know, oh yeah, it bleeds a little bit, you don't worry about it. In the middle of the night, you wake up, it's like throbbing, it's red, it's hot. And that's your natural innate defense responding to trauma to the body. So what happens is when those respiratory cells rupture because so many viral particles are bursting out, your body goes into its innate defense, you get vasodilation, they're trying to put all the blood to that area of trauma so that all of those immune cells that are going to remove the pathogen from the body get there, get into the tissue and fight. But that causes, that vasodilation causes your plasma to flow out of your blood system, and then it ends up in your lungs. And then now you're not getting oxygen diffusion, and so all of the sickness that occurs with that, and then that's leaving you, you can't get it all up, and so that leaves you for secondary lung infections. When they get into the bloodstream, then they can, that's when you start getting a more systemic inflammation response, and where you start getting organ failure because you've now leaked so much fluid out of your circulatory system. All of your organs have to work harder because your blood pressure has dropped dramatically. But they're all function like that.
How do you feel as health professionals that when you have the hand sanitizer with all the antibacterial chemicals in there, especially now that we're having, how do you correlate that to now that we're having more superbugs, more resistance? Is this something that you would recommend people to use or not?
It depends. At least in our setting, most of them are alcohol-based. It's really not the antibacterial, it's the alcohol that denatures the outside of the protein in the areas. So we actually have them all over the place, primarily because in a quick setting, it is best to wash your hands every time. I wash my hands in the room, I wash my hands out of the room. But I also hand sanitize in between, which is our current infection control recommendation. But again, we're dealing with sort of a different setting maybe than you might in a normal population. But the antibacterial soap, I think what she was getting at is that soap is antibacterial. It's by definition, SDS, which is the main component of soap, is what makes things kind of separate themselves in the fatty acids. So you don't really need antibacterial soap. It's sort of redundant. But as far as like using it, hand sanitizer, it's for at least for the ones we use are primarily alcohol based, and I suspect it's more of the alcohol based from our infection control. I couldn't tell you like the worldwide because most of what I do is in controlled settings, but.
The soap also, washing your hands with soap detaches the cells and viruses from the surface of your skin. So you really need hot water, soap, lots of soap, and wash them. And that physically removes the microbes from your hands. When I'm asked about hand sanitizers, the studies I've read said that they're not effective, that people rely too heavily on them. One of the things that couple of things that these alcohol-based hand sanitizers do. First of all, if you're someone who has dry skin anyways, they dry your hands out, and so then you get cuts, and that just represents an entryway into the body. The other thing that it does is it tends to change the keratin that is the glue that holds your skin cells together. It denatures that, and it actually provides kind of a nice little, even tighter adhesive mechanism for cells to stay stuck on there. So every time you're using them, you're actually might be creating conditions that will harbor more cells. So there's many studies that show that. There's a couple that say, oh no, they work great. I mean, alcohol, if you use it at the right percentage, can be very effective. It's not like bleach, which is, a really cheap, great disinfectant. But that if you do them, that like I recommend that every third time you need to clean your hands, you're using hot water and soap. just to avoid some of those other things that happen.
Like I said, I wash in, I wash out, I use in between. So I think the other part of that is how often you do it. If you were doing it every single time, all the time, it can really cause. And I did that my first year. I was like, whoo, my whole hands were red. So it's good in all things in moderation, right? It's good for certain situations and certain times, particularly when you're not somewhere where you can get to water and soap. But I wouldn't necessarily say you should be using it all day, every day. I tend to wash when I walk in, wash when I walk out, and then usually after I glove with every patient, and then I use the sanitizer in between. So I guess I'm washing 2 out of 3 times.
I just wondered, what is the standard protocol with the flu? Is there a standard in the medical community for a protocol, or what kind of steps or phases you might use as different patients have more difficult time with the disease?
So basically, what happens when you call, or what happens when you do that? So there is actually a relatively standardized protocol in the sense that we have, and maybe I'll give you a chance if you've done all of that, who gets Tamiflu, who doesn't get Tamiflu, or who should or shouldn't. So basically, we have about a 48 to 72 hour window to get a medication. And I say Tamiflu, I'm not being paid by Tamiflu, it's just the one I use most often because it's easiest. Relenza is a little harder to tolerate. So what usually happens is there are certain diseases and comorbidities over the age of 65, definitely under the age of 2, patients who have known COPD, smoking disease, some people might call it, known heart disease, diabetes, and this is a small list, is not universal. Patients who are on immunosuppressants, some patients, you might know people who have rheumatoid arthritis, and a lot of those patients are on prednisone or autoimmune disorder medications. Being at that, those sort of medical conditions put you at much higher risk for those complications that we were talking about. So those are the patients we primarily try to treat with the Tamiflu if we get them in the first 48 to 72 hours. After that, there's no data. The interesting thing about it is that, at least when I started, the data, someone asked me about the other new drug, said that it decreased symptoms about a half a day, which in the beginning, especially with Relenza, was not really that big a deal. It does seem to decrease the complications rather significantly versus the time of the flu. So usually what I tell patients is if you think you have the flu and you think you're in that category, call your doctor and we'll talk to you about whether you should or shouldn't and whether you need to come in or not. The biggest thing you need to do is fluids. Very few people drink enough water. My daughter gave me influenza last year. And she got really dehydrated really quickly. I ended up bringing her to my own hospital, and as I was walking in, she passed out. Now, she just hadn't been drinking that whole day. She'd been in school. It just was a day. But she got 1.5 liters of fluid, which there's a lot of technical stuff, but for a 12-year-old, it's almost trauma level. That's how dry she was in a day, because she'd been sick all day and didn't realize she was sick and didn't really want to miss school, just had no awareness. So it can become very rapid. Those patients who become very acutely ill, we still try to use the Tamiflu in. So even if you're between the ages of, there's some debate between 2 and 5 whether you should get it, but between 5 and 65, for the most part, if you're doing okay with it, we only have those first 72 hours. Most people don't need Tamiflu. The majority of people don't. It's the secondary complications, the kid with the ear infection. Those we have to watch out for.
How long do these germs live on door handles and knobs and bathrooms?
24 to 48 hours.
Yes, it does. Unless it's more something. Yes. There are some viruses last for a shorter period of time, but there are some bacteria that can live for quite some time, which is why, I would laugh. In my pocket is a hand sanitizer that I will be using after I meet all of you. I wear a mask all day. But it's not just that. Someone asked me in the office, that was a really good question. I've never realized, is it good to wash my jacket and my hands and my mittens and all those things? I don't think I've ever seen a study that shows that makes any difference. You have a nice clean coat, but I don't know that it's going to stop the germs when if you cough and you sneeze, don't cough in your hand, cough here. But yeah, the door handles, I wipe down when you go to the grocery store, I use those all the time. I annoy the people because when they're empty, I make them fill them and wipe them down again because it is on there for 24 to 48 hours. But there are some bacteria that can live a lot longer. C. diff, MRSA.
And say spores, yeah, they'll live for a long time.
They can live for a long time.
So even viruses, I actually think the influenza virus is a little bit sturdier than 2 days, about a week. Some of the others could be several weeks. Then you have other viruses, you know, like HIV, which is a wimp, it can't stay outside the body. Bacteria are a whole different story. Most people, you know, historically everybody thought, oh, you know, bacteria are busy growing, but bacteria spend most of their time doing nothing. And when they're not doing anything, that means they're pretty protected, so they can sit on anything for long periods of time, even if they're not spore formers. So it's always good to wash your hands and keep them out of your orifices.
You can spend a lot of money on the spray bleach. A 10% bleach solution, which is essentially a cup of bleach in a gallon of water, will cost you about 2 cents. And then you can take it and just wipe everything down, let it dry. Don't let your kids eat it like a Tide Pod, but just, you know, wipe everything down. And that is probably the most effective way to kill everything. Okay, bleach is pretty good at that. But you don't need to spend $4.99 on the Lysol beach spray. You can spend 3 cents and use bleach and warm water.
I was wondering if there's any advantage to just allowing yourself to experience the flu before you're at a fragile age. Do you build up any antibodies by having the flu versus getting a flu shot?
Because the virus mutates every year, you don't build up an immunity to next year's strain because it's always changing. The flu makes you feel terrible. Terrible. There's no advantage to letting yourself experience the flu, especially with all the conditions that it can create, the negative effects on your body, the pneumonia that you can get from it. It's really, there's no advantage to it.
I absolutely agree. You may have been there, not been here earlier when I said my daughter gave me the flu this year, and it felt like someone shot me. I was like to get up and go to the bathroom. I'd forgotten because I'm always so careful about it, but I would not wish that on my worst enemy. And I will tell you, the patient came in the other day. She hadn't gotten her flu shot, and her daughter got the flu. And she came in and she goes, I will never say no again, ever. Oh my God, it's been 2 weeks and I still can't move. It is true influenza. And the hard part is a lot of people call the stomach bug the flu. If you have diarrhea, that's not usually influenza, okay? The vomiting isn't usually influenza. People say, my mother did this to me the other day. She said, I have postnasal drip. I said, no, you have croup, goodbye. So true influenza is severe body aches, high fever, 103, 104, secondary infections. There is no benefit to you to go through natural immunity. There was a period of time many years ago, like I talked about the measles parties, the mumps parties, the chicken pox parties. I still don't think that was a good idea. But I guess, you know, it was a time before me. My son got chickenpox at 8 months old. He was probably the last natural chickenpox I've seen, because my husband let somebody with shingles touch him. He's 17 years old. My husband still knows that he let somebody with shingles touch my child while I wasn't there. He was pretty sick. He was sick for about 2 weeks. It was not a beautiful natural immunity, because I didn't remember it being that bad. I was 5 or 6, but he was 8 months old. He had high fevers. He was really sick. Natural immunity to some things, I guess, is good, but the disease is pretty serious. So I would encourage you just to get vaccinated and not go through the flu. Most of my patients who go through true flu, and I mean diagnosed influenza, it's influenza, they always come back the next year saying, when's that flu shot coming out? Because I don't want to do that again. I missed work for 7 to 10 days. We had a woman in our office who was out for 2.5 weeks. And she had gotten vaccinated, but unfortunately she sits in the front, and my one request anyway, if you have a fever and you don't feel well and you go to the doctor's office, put a mask on. For all those little kids hanging out with you, whether you know you have flu or not, infection control. Don't go visit your grandbaby or your brother, sister's mother's uncle. Stay home. Flu is bad. Flu is awful, and flu kills people. The pandemic someone mentioned earlier killed 25 million people 100 years ago. 25 million people when we did not have the ability to travel the way that we travel. So ponder that for a moment. 25 million people during World War I. And it wasn't just World War I, it went through all of the areas throughout. That's a lot of people.
Please join me in thanking our panel.